I had four teenagers in high school, but he's the one I never worried about. He was a very compliant child. He got a scholarship out of 8th grade to go to Catholic high school. He was only happy with himself and pleased with himself if he could get A+ on everything. So he was very much a perfectionist, which now I know sometimes can be a very difficult road for young people when they have such high expectations of themselves, and maybe somewhat realistic when they get an A-. But he never was into drugs. He thought drugs and even smoking a cigarette, he just thought that was all kind of stupid. He had a car, he had a job at Baskin Robbins, worked part-time there, and they found him to be such a responsible young man that he closed up the shop the night that he actually killed himself. Fortunately, he did not do it at home. So he actually ended up dying in the hospital. He was found on a road in Sacramento with sitting outside the car after having used a gun. But he didn't actually die. It looked like he was dead when we saw him in the hospital, but his heart was still beating. It was like 10 o'clock the next day. I was in shock. I think all of us were in shock, totally blindsided. We had no really good warning signs at all, nothing that out of the ordinary. I think back, and he was a little bit kind of touchy the last few months or so, but he was a teenager, and I didn't consider that serious because I think that, growing up and being a teenager and trying to figure out what you want to do in your career and going to college and everything is a tough time, and you can kind of get frustrated with yourself and frustrated with all of the decisions you have to make. So, but he did plan it. Since he was such a perfectionist, he also planned with perfection how he was going to die. Wrote 7 notes, included notes to his classmate who he wanted to have his golf clubs. He had notes to his brother that he could have all of his things. He had notes to his family. And the only clue that we had in his note to family, it was like addressed, "Dear family, this is nobody's fault. I just don't have any future." So that was not rational thinking at all, not for this young man at all. So I was surprised that he was feeling that way. That was really a surprise. What I've learned later, though, that there was and there is a genetic disposition in our family for depression. There's a heavy family history on my husband's side of alcoholism. All the men were alcoholics. My husband had been an alcoholic for a while, and then he did quit cold at one time and never went back to drinking again. But this vulnerability to depression is probably stronger than I ever realized at the time. So it took me some years later, and I thought, that's what these people are medicating their depression. So, and if you add that to drinking, if you add alcohol, and then you just like putting gasoline on the fire for your depression. So it's very sad. Yesterday, I was at his gravesite. It was yesterday, Monday. I was at his gravesite with 2 of my sons. And one of my youngest son, who was only 2.5 at the time, so he doesn't remember his brother, said he took a knee down, just like you see at the football games, but he took one knee down and he was just kneeling there at the gravesite. And he got up and he said, and we got in his car and was driving away. And he said, now this young man he's now pushing, what is he? He's 45 years old. And so he, at 2.5, of course, he did not remember his brother at all. And he probably hasn't been to that cemetery only once a few years ago. And this was probably the second time he's ever been to that cemetery. And he said, and he has teenagers now. So it was a kind of a light bulb moment for him, which is what we all have from time to time, is these light bulb moments. And you think, that's what was going on. That's what happened. oh dear. It just, we don't have all the answers in the beginning, and it takes a long time and a long pathway to try to come to grips with some of the answers. But my son Michael said, Mom, he said, it's got to be really hard when you're a teenager. You're basically a kid. I mean, you're basically a youngster. And to not have the hope of a future and cannot see beyond that time of what you're going to be like in 10 years, or what's going to happen in 10 years, 5 years. And he was reflecting on the fact that Stephen had died at 18, and it made him stop and think about youngsters and how difficult it can be to be in that place, and how important it is, I think, as parents, and he is a very good parent, to check in with your kids and see what's going on in their heads. So anyway, so Steve died in 77, and then I was out advocating. About 4 years later, I was out advocating for a suicide prevention for students and teens. And I was looking for letters for the California legislators to encourage them to vote and approve this measure that I was working on with a group of professionals. There's a long story how that happened. How I even got on a committee. Being a mom with no letters after my name, and all of them were PhDs, and they were all very highly educated and people that knew a lot about suicide. And I was on the committee, and I didn't know why I should even be there. I thought, what can I ever contribute as a mom? I mean, I don't have this background. I'm not a social worker or anything. I'm a mom of 7 kids. And one of the persons, Charlotte Ross, who got me involved, I asked her, I said, what can I possibly contribute to this? And she said, you will keep them honest. And I thought, oh, okay. There's nothing like us survivors speaking up and telling our story, because people will listen, and you can make changes in the people around you and in the community when you honestly can face what happened and learn from it. So that was my first real learning experience with all of this. So because I was working on legislation, I went to Compassionate Friends because there were parents there that lost children. And I thought, well, there must be few parents there who've had a suicide death. And that's where I met Chris Moon. And she and I sort of started talking and realizing this grief after suicide is difficult, and it's really hard. We were both doing pretty well, actually. We didn't need the help, but we knew that there were a lot of people out there struggling with the same thing and wouldn't have a place to go. If they'd lost a husband, if they'd lost an uncle or grandparent or some other relative or friend, there was no support group to go where you could actually talk about the word say the word suicide, and actually discuss the aftermath of a suicide death. What is it to go through? What helps us and what doesn't help us? So that was the beginning. She and I talked, and we decided we would research our community and see, is there really a need for it, or we just think there is? So after discussing it with several people in the community, they all said, go for it, go for it, go for it. And that's what we did. So we started with our first meeting in Chris's home in Fair Oaks, California. We had, I think it's 8 people attended. And that was on February 3rd. So that in 1983. So that was just 37 years ago, a few days ago. And from there, 6 of those people decided that they would help us develop. And well, we didn't know about developing. We were just going to have some meetings. We had no idea what was going to happen. It was a total surprise of how many people started calling us. Suicide prevention was referring people to us. Compassionate Friends was. Funeral directors were referring people to us. So we started getting calls, and little by little, we went from one meeting, and a couple of years later, we added a second meeting and then a third meeting. And so we grew slowly, so we really grew into this organization. So over the years, the board of directors, which is something more than 50 people at this point that have contributed, they are the ones that have designed and developed our program as it is right now. And the basic thing that we have developed is an atmosphere of hospitality at meetings, and also an atmosphere in our newsletter that helps people. If they can't get to a meeting, here's a meeting in print in many ways. That newsletter is a meeting in print. You get to share, you get to read, you can listen to other people's responses and how they coped, and get some suggestions for healthy coping. So we don't end up, sitting in a closet somewhere with a bottle of booze, just, dying ourselves. So it's our desire to give hope, and so we do that by comforting and encouraging people, and then also educating after we finally feel like we found people that we can talk to. So that's been our goal from all these years, but it grew very, very slowly. It's taken a lot of years, but we now have over 5,000 people on our database, and Susan can tell you more just specifics on that. I've not gathered all of the last numbers, but I think we probably have had at least 10,000 first-time callers over the 37 years. So it's amazing. I'm just amazed that many people have come by and called for help, because when we started, suicide was not a subject that was talked about at all in the papers, in the books. There was no books about it, for lay people. There was a few people that wrote professionally on suicide, but they were mostly clinical books. So there were no books. There were no articles in the newspaper. Nobody talked about suicide, and I did not know that teenagers killed themselves. It never entered my mind that a teenager would. When I was reading in the Sacramento Bee that there had been somebody who's jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, which is the only time I ever read anything in the paper that had suicide in it. They would just say victim number such and such, 345 or whatever it was, had jumped off the bridge. So I assumed, in my mind, I thought that was people who had no family, were probably homeless, living under a bridge somewhere, had no family, had no hope, probably alcoholics, and just totally isolated people that didn't have any future. And that made sense to me. I mean, what else would I think? I did not know anybody that had died from suicide that was in our community. And so I was totally blindsided by it all. It was just unbelievable. My sister-in-law from South Dakota called, and she said, somebody must have killed him. And I said, no, I have to say it was a suicide. And a lot of people were totally in shock. Our whole neighborhood was in shock, actually, because he delivered Sacramento Bee newspapers to them for years. He'd been their paper boy in our street, in our neighborhood. So the whole neighborhood knew him and would never have dreamed that he would ever do something like this. So we were all shocked. So what else would you like to know that I haven't quite figured yet?
The one thing that when in our support group meetings, it has come up a couple of times, and I wanted to share with our group tonight, the people that leave a note, and you and I've talked a little bit about this, Marilyn. We get mixed reactions. Some people are very uncomfortable talking about there was a note, there was no note. Some people feel slighted that they didn't get a note. So how do you feel? Was that helpful? Did it not really make a difference? Because Stephen wrote multiple notes.
Well, he wrote one to the police, one to a girl he'd had one date with, wanted to give her his car, wrote to his brother. I'm trying to think of the young man that he wanted to give his golf clubs to. At least, there were a total of 7 notes. What was helpful for me to read, what that one phrase out of the note that was to family that said, that one note said, this is no one's fault. I just don't have any future. I mean, it didn't make sense to me, but that's the only little crumb of understanding I had of what was going on in his head. Because his grades never failed. He never, there weren't any signs. He wasn't drinking. He always came home on time. He was doing his job. He bought his car with his own money. he was totally responsible young man. So how could a totally responsible young man who was so conscientious in school and well-liked, and he was witty, he was known for his wit in school.
Mm-hmm.
It was even in their yearbook about how witty Steve was. So how could someone like that end up killing himself in such a violent way?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody, and he never ever said anything to anybody, because we've had people, there's a young man that had lunch with him every day at school. They
Mm-hmm.
used to sit together. And he said, I've gone through every conversation I ever had with him, and he never said anything.
Mm.
So the whole school was shocked.
Yeah.
Because you think that they're kids that are acting out or in trouble. Well, they're not the only ones that may be at risk for suicide.
Right.
And maybe, honestly, I sort of think we don't know what can happen in our own lives and where we would be at risk for suicide too. We don't know what our limits are. We don't know, most people, you do the best you can and you don't kill yourself, but we don't know what can happen to any one of us, where we could find ourselves kind of deep in a pit and think there's just no way out.
Right.
So the notes can be helpful, but researchers, back to the whole basic
Yeah.
thing about notes, is the researchers show that most people do not leave notes.
Ah.
That's what the numbers are.
Well, I remember in one of our support group meetings, somebody had said, I did get a note and it didn't really make a difference because the note was kind of an extension of their loved ones' turmoil that they had internally going on. So it didn't offer any enlightenment for that particular person.
Yeah. But except that does tell you there was things going on in their heads that they had not probably shared with us.
Right.
We weren't aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that is promoting to promote suicide prevention, is the fact that we all need to kind of open up to what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
not keep these things in our heads,
Mm-hmm.
Ask for some help.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let it just go around in your head alone, and just have that tape that in your brain going over and over and over again, how depressed I am and how hopeless it is. You need to say something. You need to get some input, because you lose your perspective like Steve did by doing that, and like by most people that have ended up dying by suicide. They've lost their perspective.
You and I've had this conversation before. I met Marilyn when I first went to a Friends for Survival support group meeting, almost 3 years ago. And then I started volunteering with the organization. I needed to do my own, a term that I learned, grief work. I needed to do my own grief work before I could really feel like I could be a help to others. So grief work is defined as it's a process that we engage in as active participants, and that grief demands our attention, refusing to go away automatically with the passage of time. So thinking back after Steve died, what grief work or what did you do to get through, every day?
I cried all the time. I was crying every day for, I don't know, 2-3 years at least, every day, especially if I was in the car driving by myself. It's the perfect time to cry, but it's not very safe to be doing that. You can kind of have blurry vision, and you're distracted because you're in so much pain. It's not a good idea to be driving and being sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. But I don't know. I prayed a lot. I just accepted the fact that this is what it was, and I didn't like it. And if it were up to me, he'd still be alive if I'd had any chance to intervene. I think it just takes a lot of time. I also had a 2.5-year-old, and I had those other teenagers in high school. So I had a lot going on. I didn't function really very well in the beginning. I only did what I absolutely had to. But my perspective certainly changed on things. There's a lot of things that now, I look at something, when something comes up that's the challenge, I just think, well, it's not a disaster. To me, the disaster is having someone die by suicide. So anything short of that is not a disaster, and somehow we'll work it out. Some way. It'll all work out. And I just don't, I don't get as upset about little things, I don't think anymore. It has to be pretty big before I
Yeah.
get upset.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your perspectives, I think, and most people will find that their perspective on life changes a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a different person now than I ever was before. I mean, I was not this, I just developed lots of things since Steve died. Some leadership skills and things that I probably were there, but I'd never used them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's been an interesting journey, and I have met some of the most wonderful, wonderful people across this country and Sacramento and all over. Um, because that's one of the things we kind of figured out is only loving families call us, because otherwise they'd say, well, good riddance.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone that calls us cares and loved that person a great deal. So this person didn't die for lack of love.
Mm-hmm.
They never died for lack of love. There were people around them that cared about them and that would have done anything to avert the suicide death they're now having to cope with. So I think it changes all of our lives. For the most part, it does. We look at things differently. I certainly can pick up on people that are depressed. People, you might ask somebody, "Oh, how you doing?" or some little remark, and you kind of get a gut feeling that there's more to it, and you can engage them and start talking, and you find out all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think my level of sensitivity has really skyrocketed compared to, I never would have noticed all these things before, but I do now.
I wanted to let our people know that are attending this webinar that you have known some of the pioneers basically, and I think you and I talked a little bit about this, supporting survivors. What is it called? Suicidology. You used a term today, and I can't remember
Yeah.
what it was.
Uh,
But Iris Bolton, you've
mhm.
known for 40,
Yeah.
almost 40 years. Loretta Archibald, you've known. Iris Bolton, you were telling me, well, talk a little bit about Iris. I just read
Okay.
the book.
So when we started with this, the one person, Charlotte Ross, who sort of put me on this, kind of pointed me in this direction,
Mhm.
one of the things she told me, she says, you need to read some books about suicide. Well, prior to 1982, I did not read anything about suicide, and I did not want to learn anything about suicide because it was so awful and so ugly. I couldn't imagine reading about it would help one iota. I just didn't see it. And so I started reading, and I've always liked to learn things, and I loved going to school, but I didn't want to learn about suicide. It was just such a horrible thing. So I started reading a book, or I watched, there was a movie, and now I can't remember what it was exactly. But anyway, I started doing that and realizing, well, I better learn something about this. So if I was going to advocate for the suicide prevention for teenagers. So I went to a national, she invited me to go to my first national conference from the American Association of Suicidology, which is called AAS for short. Uh, they are their office is in Washington, D.C. And I went to it in San Diego and started meeting people. And I went because I began to realize that I needed to learn some things and get acquainted, but mostly to learn. So I would sit in on the researchers and listen to them, and half the time with all of their extensive, complicated charts and so on, I couldn't comprehend that, but I got a lot out of those national meetings. And I went for the last 37 years. I probably have gone to, I would say, about 30 of them perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And there's where I met some national people that were just angels. They cared so much, and they were kind of in the same place I was. It was the beginning of the time in the 80s when survivors, after family members, started to talk about how to cope with a suicide death. And Iris was one of the first ones, and Loretta was one of the first ones. And they both have written books now, and they've done speaking. Iris Bolton's been a conference speaker here in Sacramento for us. They're amazing people who have gotten into this only because their sons died by suicide. And all three of us had our sons die within about 2 or 3 years of each other. So we were kind of all in the same initial boat. And we're the ones that decided to keep going and doing the same thing, keep reaching out to survivors, trying to make a difference. And there were not any support groups for survivors. And so that was the kind of thing that the professionals thought that the people should go to therapy, and support groups weren't really valued at that point. So it's come a long ways that now is a valuable resource that is recognized by this whole field of suicide as being a very helpful thing for families after suicide death, as much as it is to get therapy in your grief, one-on-one therapy with therapists, but it also has a lot to do with suicide prevention too, very much so. And Stephanie Weber Shaplika in Chicago is another one. Father Ruby out of Chicago is another one of the pioneers. So there was many of us. Virginia Bender up in Portland started a group all by herself up there about 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, after the death of her daughter. Now most all of us are parents. Most of us are moms of lost children. And I think there's that special kind of focus and passion to think that, we lost a child, and we know what it's like to have lost a child, but there are other people who have lost husbands and other relatives, and their pain is also very, very great. Mm-hmm. But I think we just got kind of emboldened by the death of one of our kids. And of course, most of them are boys, because 4 out of 5 suicide deaths are males. So 3 of us lost boys. Stephanie lost her mother, and Virginia lost her daughter, and the other 3 of us have lost our sons. So it did change our lives totally. I mean, I'd never be doing this. I'd be, I got 19 grandchildren I could make cookies for.
And some great-grandchildren too.
Yeah, 14.
Yeah.
14 great-grandchildren.
14 great-grandchildren? Wow, that's amazing.
Great.
So is there one book that you've read that's just your absolute favorite? Because I've read half a dozen now, and they all, I don't know, I don't really have a favorite. They've all given me something. Do you have one that is your favorite?
Well, they are all different. Iris's book, of course, My Son is a classic. It was one of the early books. And now I'm going blank on there's another one written by a pastor that After Suicide, I think it's called After Suicide. And that was one that was in print when we started. There were only 3 books in print that had to do with grief and suicide.
Wow.
All the rest of them were all about prevention and written by researchers and professionals. And they're honestly, they're not helpful to us because they're too much psychobabble in them. I mean, we want to know, how do I get through today? What do I do when I can't, my appetite's gone and got a recurrence of cancer. I mean, there's so many stories and things there, but we need people who have been there. When I share, I talk about the fact that I don't know what it's like to have cancer. I don't know what it's like to have my house burned down in a fire. We all know what we've been through, and we have some insight into our own personal experience. But it's that experience that gives us the compassion and understanding for other people that are in similar situations as we have been in. And that's why peer support groups are so helpful to people. I think it's really important to have been there. And that's one of our guidelines. We have over the years had a few volunteers tabbing letters or something that were not survivors, but 99.9% of the people that we have crossed paths with have all been affected by a suicide death of another person. And I think that's really important.
Well, we all certainly have we understand what someone's going through when we're talking to them. The one I wanted to mention one more book that I don't know, it was so good. And you mentioned Loretta Archibald. I'm putting it up right now. It's Finding Peace Without All the Pieces. I know I lost my cousin to suicide. His mother, my auntie, really found that book very comforting, extremely
It
comforting,
is. It's a great book. It's a great book.
extremely helpful. And it's Loretta just, it's like I'm reading it and I'm just feeling her like a big warm hug around me. It's just like, oh my gosh, she's just explaining this so well. Um, so one thing I wanted to have you talk a little bit about too is the Pathways book. So talk a little bit about that and what it is.
Well, fortunately, we were able to get a contract with this indirectly the state of California. They financed a book that was actually a manual on how to start, expand a sustainable, effective peer support, bereavement support program after a suicide death.
Mm-hmm.
So it has 130 some pages. It's from A to Z, everything you need to know to start a group, to expand it, but also to be sustainable and effective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our goal. Is we plan on being here for as long as you need us. Long after I'm gone, this organization has got to keep going. Because the need is not going to go away. The need is always going to be there. There is no amount of suicide prevention that is going to prevent all suicide deaths. So I think this gap of grievers that we try to provide our services to is always going to be there, and we need to support it and keep it going strong and effective. And we have some wonderful volunteers, facilitators, some dedicated volunteers now, and we have had for the past 37 years. I mean, we never even had staff for about 30 of those years. I think
Mm-hmm.
we got staff in about 2000. We were just looking that up, 10, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
About 2010 before we ever had any paid staff.
So who did
So,
everything before then, Marilyn?
yeah, I did, and I was getting kind of wore out. But the people were wonderful, and it went slowly too.
Mm-hmm.
I was answering all the phone calls from home.
Mm-hmm.
We operated out of my home. My home was the physical address for the mailing, and then about 95 we rented an office, but basically it was just put stuff there because I was going to have to move.
Mm-hmm.
So people can do this and do it well. We've got all kinds of guidelines in print now. You can get the Pathways book. You can download it off of our website.
Mm-hmm.
It's also under the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. They have it on their website. You can download it there. You can contact us and we can help you with that. I think it's everything we learned in the 33 years about that at that point when we finished it. So, or has it been, no, about 30 years. It'd been going about 30 years at the time we did the book. So it's everything we've learned over those 30 years with 50 board members and a lot of advisors and a lot of other volunteers in the community that have helped us.
Mm-hmm.
It's totally thorough.
It really is. It's an amazing tool. I mean, even if you just want to just go in and read it, if you're even thinking about maybe you guys that are attending, if you want to start a support group or you want to support a friend, there's some really helpful things in there. And
we would help you. We'd come and
yes.
help you no matter where you live.
Yep. We can come help you.
I would love to do that.
So what do you do today, Marilyn, with your grief work? What do you do today? I mean, you mentioned something a little earlier about you did go to the cemetery and you took flowers. Is there something you do annually or every day, to remember Steve?
Work with Friends for Survival.
Mm-hmm.
Really. I mean, it's in spite of what a sad, horrendous, and awful
Mm-hmm.
situation a suicide death is, our office is a happy place because we see that we help people. We really make a difference. We see the notes they send us, the phone calls. People call for the first time and they'll say, "Thank you so much. I feel so much better now." I mean, how can you not feel better about
Mm-hmm.
that?
Mm-hmm.
So when we have a really dedicated staff, really, really dedicated. Um, so if you're interested in working with us a little more, we'd love to have you. And somebody's got to take my place someday. I'm getting too old to keep doing this. And so somebody who wants to dedicate some time, come on down, contact
You
us.
got at least 30 more years in you. You got.
I don't think so. No, not
Yeah,
possible.
Marilyn's going to be 82 soon. In case you didn't know that, she's going to be 82 years old here pretty soon. So she runs circles around me most days.
So can we maybe I could retire when we hit 40 years of this organization, huh?
Well, we'll
So
talk.
come on, guys. We all got to work together at this. We can help one another. And it really is a very, very satisfying position that I've been in all these years. I just never knew I'd meet all these people. I've met Judy Collins. I've met all kinds of really famous people. Gloria Vanderbilt one time, even she's had a suicide. There's a lot of major name people that have had to deal with a suicide death that have written books and or has been speakers at the conferences that I've met. And they're all just caring, loving people. And, it's just sad that we're having to go through all this, but I can never have helped anybody if I hadn't gone through it first. I never would have been able to be any effective. But I do tell one thing that I know that Susan and I talked about is one of the things that was helpful the most when I was especially in the early stages in crying, and I end up crying at places where there were other people around. If they just hold my hand while I cried and said nothing, the fact that they do that means they care about my pain, and that is comforting, and it warms your heart to think somebody cares about me enough to do that. There have been other times when there was a time when I knew I was going to have one of those gut wrenching sobs come up, and Stephen had been gone about 5-6 years, and I was actually, I don't talk about this very often, but I was actually in choir practice, and they asked for some prayer, a church choir practice, some prayer for some family that their husband had died by suicide. And I mean, we're practicing, songs, and I was like, and it hit me. It just hit me really hard, and I knew I had to get out of the room because I was going to be a sobbing mess.
Oh.
I got up and I went into the hallway, and wouldn't you know, somebody came down the hallway, and I'm leaning against the wall sobbing, and they came up to me, put their arms around me, hugged me until I could stop crying.
Wow.
And that was the best thing anybody could have done for me. But we do all at different times have triggers, and there are times when something is said or done, or a picture, a song, another experience. Someone else dies in our family, maybe in a different way, but it can bring back a lot of our grief. And we've all got tear ducts, and we should use them, keep them washed out.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
Well, Tara has a question, or I see she's raised her hand, but I'm trying to figure out how to read her question. While I'm trying to figure that out, Marilyn, what other things that have really helped you, or things that have given you hope and have helped you cope?
Oh, the fact that I had other children, that was a big deal too. I remember coming home from the hospital and thinking, I don't know what I would do if this was my only child. So I can't imagine how hard that is to have an only child and end up with a suicide death. So I did have children. I did have good friends. My immediate family outside of my own children and husband were not in this area. My brother and sister lived across the country. So I didn't have any close family outside of my own personal family, but I have always been blessed with lots of, some good friends and good neighbors. The neighbors all came and they brought food, and probably every neighbor on the block was bringing food over to our house when Steve died. And the kids were in the local school 3 blocks away from our house. So there was a lot of people from the school where my kids had already attended and still had some children in that school. Um, so, I was fortunate with that, that I didn't feel totally alone.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I really didn't know anybody else who had had suicide deaths, or at least I thought I hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
It was years later that I remembered my brother-in-law, my husband's brother, his wife, his ex-wife had died by suicide. And I knew that. But when Steve died, it wasn't upper in my brain. And I thought for years I had never known anybody who died by suicide. And yet I knew about her. I don't think they had a funeral for her because I don't remember going to a funeral. But she was a very, very, very bad alcoholic.
Mm.
And she lived under some circumstances that, were not healthy in many ways. And so she left a teenage boy, not it wasn't a nephew of ours. It was a child that she had from a previous marriage. But um, it's amazing what your brain does to you. Where there are parts you don't remember that you should have.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of a surprise to me
Mm-hmm.
when and that was probably 10 years down the road or something before that even dawned on me that, oh, there had been another suicide.
So you
Since
just get that
then,
realization,
since then,
right?
one of my cousin's sons has killed himself also, and I've had a couple of friends, casual friends that are extended friends that have killed themselves too. So,
So in nearly 44 decades, nearly 40 decades that you've been doing this, has there anything really surprised you? Uh, Offering support to survivors, just personally, and then the support that you give.
well, something that's come up within the last 6 months or so
Mm-hmm.
is we were doing some editing or auditing on our reaching out
Mm-hmm.
of our page in our newsletter. And
Mm-hmm.
I started looking at the dates that people of the person that died. And for the most part, people call us probably within 6 months
Mm-hmm.
of the death. And I have been amazed, like a third of that list, approximately a third of that list, has been on our mailing list for close to 20 years.
Wow.
And I think there's a lot to learn from that we need to be providing services for a long-term basis, if that's important. And it isn't because they're in a bad place for 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
but they still find comfort in what they read.
Mm-hmm.
It still makes a difference in their life now.
Mm-hmm.
So the newsletter to me is the most valuable thing we do.
Mm-hmm.
The most very, very valuable thing. If we had to cut anything at all, the last thing I'd cut would be the newsletter,
Yeah.
because I think it reaches more people um, on a very regular monthly basis. So they get a little something every month from us. And there's no other way to do that except by an email or newsletter,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's email or hard copy, it doesn't matter. It's just a matter of getting some positive things that recognize the grief that you have. And it's something, there's a point where you always have some of that, but it isn't so intense, and it isn't, it isn't changing your life.
Mm-hmm.
You still can be a productive human being after 20 years, but still find that newsletter really comforting and encouraging. And also, a lot of people pass it out to other people and friends and to professionals, and the newsletter travels a lot further than just their mailbox often. So that's an important thing too, because it's a good tool for helping people around you.
Mm-hmm. I
So
agree.
I think that's been amazing to me to realize that the length that we've had the same families getting our services.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we need to feel bad about that. I think that's a positive thing, especially when they tell us, "Oh yes, I give this out and all the time. I always keep a copy with me, and I have it with me. I run across somebody, and I share it with them, um, and that's fabulous." So we've gotten to the point, even though we're grieving, we find it helpful. We pass it on to other people, and that's probably the best thing of all. Is that's what we're doing. So
Right. I agree. We get so many nice notes from people all the time. Just quick little notes. You know, keep up the good work. So if any of you have questions, please go ahead and post them in the webinar chat. A couple of people raised their hands. I think I'm doing it right. I'm not sure. Terry, did you have a question? Joanne, did you have a question? Just go ahead and type it in the chat box and I will see it. Um, let's see. One thing I wanted to share that I learned in my meetings is when people come to our support group meetings that we have in Northern California, sometimes people just come once and we don't see them again. Sometimes they come every month. But I remember, and I don't know if you remember this, Marilyn, last year we broke into small groups and this mom had come and it had been about 5 or 6 months since she had lost her daughter. And she had two girls and the younger daughter was struggling, but everybody was things were starting to even out a little bit. So this woman that came to our meeting, her friends had been doing the whole, why aren't you coming to meet us for lunch? And, you need to move on. And, those things that just make us cringe every time we hear them. And we were in a small group and uh, I asked everyone in my little breakout session, well, what do you think? And one of the moms looked her straight in the eye and grabbed her by the hand and said, if you feel like getting up in the morning and making yourself a cup of tea and sitting in your fuzzy pajamas and staring out the window, that's what you do. And the woman just kind of went, oh, and like she was given permission to just not have to be getting on with life, so to speak. So that was very profound for me to see the weight just kind of come off of her. And I wanted to share that with you guys. And Marilyn, you've seen it happen over and over and over again. There is no timeline for any of this. There really isn't.
No. It's just that we want to be able to help you not get stuck where you aren't functioning at all. And it's been 10 years and you're not functioning, or it's 5 years and you've not made any progress. Come to a meeting, reread the newsletter, see a therapist, whatever. I mean, it takes years to get back to the point of being the productive person that you might have been before.
I do have a question I'd like you to address,
Okay.
Marilyn.
Sure.
So the question is that people will say, didn't you see the signs? And they make you feel guilty. And people that maybe were there in the beginning have disappeared. And, what do we do with that?
There are times maybe when you don't feel up to responding to these people. And one of the ways to get away from that, first of all, and I'll give you some other suggestions, but this one, first of all, we're not obliged to explain our feelings to anybody. We are not obliged to answer their questions. But sometimes they can ask you something and it's the inappropriate time, or it's something you don't know how to answer. And you can say, I just don't feel up to talking about it at this time. I'm just not ready to yet. And that will shut them up. Because sometimes people ask you questions, didn't you see the signs? Well, that's kind of, it's past that. I mean, I can't go back. I can't undo it. And I perhaps didn't know what the signs were if they were there. Sometimes we've seen the signs and we did everything we could possibly do and we still can save them. So just knowing the signs is not necessarily going to save them. So it's not so simple that you can just say, yes, I saw signs, or yes, no, I didn't see any signs. I was blindsided by it. I think Steve made sure nobody saw any signs. In fact, I'm positive of that after all these years and listening to other people that knew him and so on. They never saw any sign of this stuff. And so some people don't show the signs on purpose because I think they don't want you to stop them. But just know you do not have to answer those questions. And, and just know they're saying it because they don't know what else to say or they're scared. They're curious, but protect yourself first. That's the first thing. Protect yourself by saying, "I'm just not up to talking about it right now."
Mhm.
Um, I, you
When
know,
Mar-
I'm still trying to figure it all out.
yeah,
Something generic to get them to stop asking questions that really aren't all that appropriate at this time. I mean, if somebody's died by suicide and you want to know, did you see any signs? Well, if there were signs that you saw that you want to share, you will share them without them asking. So, I mean, they're being invasive. Really, they are.
right. Well, there and
It makes you feel guilty thinking, oh, I should have seen it. But
no.
just because you see the signs, most people don't kill themselves, even though they got signs.
Hmm.
So there's no rhyme or reason to this a lot of times.
Yeah.
We can't know for sure who. There are people in horrific situations that don't kill themselves. So, and there are people that have very simple challenges and that they'll kill themselves. I mean, we're all different. So we do
So
our best.
when Marilyn was training me to come on board with Friends for Survival, we talked about this very subject, and I repeated it. I wrote it down on a little post-it note, and I just repeated it. And I talk to a lot of people, and I'll say the same thing. I'll tell them, you know what, I just can't talk. Thank you so much for your concern. I just can't talk about it right now. And that's it. Nothing else. You don't owe anyone an explanation. So verbally, I said it. If they keep coming at me, then I give a physical cue. You know what? I just can't talk about it right now. And if that doesn't work, then I just turn and walk away. And so I can tell you very quickly, because we have a couple more questions. My husband and I were meeting with our contractor last month, and somehow I mentioned that I'd lost my cousin, and my contractor turned to me and say, "Well, why'd you do that?" Well, gee, I don't know. But I mean, you see, so I didn't say that. I could feel like that gut punch. Ugh. I just took a big deep breath, and my husband stepped in and actually was my hero and just said, we never know why someone comes to that point. But it was just kind of my contractor is one of the loveliest people on the planet, but he just wasn't thinking, because he's never been in that situation.
Yeah.
It's a very insensitive thing to say, but some people just keep poking at you and poking at you. Trust me, it works. You know what? I'm sorry, I can't talk about it right now. I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
can't talk about it right now. Thank you for your concern. I can't talk about it right now. Right, Marilyn?
If you say right now, that means that maybe down the road you might, and it doesn't shut them off, like feeling like you are being rude to them or anything.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, okay. So then most people are going to not keep going and keep questioning you if you say that to them.
Well, yeah,
I
you're
mean,
right.
because if they're saying something at the grocery store or someplace that's inappropriate too, there are times when it's
Oh,
not the right place to even talk about it if you wanted to.
right.
So
I have
use
another,
it.
you're right. I have another question. Marilyn, do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea for two family members to attend the same monthly meeting at the same location? So I could well, I have good answer for this. I can
Well,
offer my input.
yeah, it can be. It depends on um, the people, but they probably are trying to protect one another by
Mhm,
what you say. You're not going to say talk as freely or share something
mhm,
that maybe you would have shared otherwise if you weren't at the same meeting.
mhm,
Um, we try to break into small groups several times a year. Um, and then that kind of helps to separate people. So they'll be in a different groups. And that way people have a chance, especially like husbands and wives come. Um, Mostly men grieve one way and women grieve another way, or at least there's different ways. And if they're in separate groups, then they can freely talk about that. Freely talk about, I don't understand why my husband doesn't cry. I'm crying all the time, and it doesn't seem to bother him, or he doesn't seem to be grieving. You can explore that with other people that are doing the similar thing, or maybe people who have been through that and they've kind of gotten past it in their marriage. So, but we have families where family members come together often, often.
Mhm.
Mothers might bring their daughter after the father has killed himself. We give people that bring their sister when they lost their brother. So there are people that come together, but in our area, they do have the ability in many of our meetings where they could go to two different meetings in the month and go to separate meetings if that's possible. And there are some people that don't want to be in the same meeting, and they'll avoid that meeting because they know so and so is there of their family. And so they'll go to a different meeting, or one of them decides not to come at all for a while. And, so yeah, it depends on the people. It depends on how well they get along together. I remember the first time you came with three aunties, and I think there were four of you
Mm-hmm.
all
All
came.
come together.
Yeah. And so it was wonderful, but you have a family that does a lot of things together.
Mm-hmm.
So they get along well together. So it's just normal for you guys. But it just depends on the family dynamics too. And sometimes people are working, and so only one of them can come, and whatever works, just take good care of yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Each of us have to take good care of ourselves.
Yeah.
Really,
And
that's the bottom line.
that is the bottom line. And if you can't come to a meeting, and the meetings are wonderful, but if you can't physically be at a meeting, that's why we're doing these webinars, so we can spend time together and be together in this moment. But also, you can call us on the phone. I mean, we have a warm line. If we don't pick it up, and we'll talk as long as you need to talk, and we can sit here and just listen, or we can offer some additional resources. uh, Marilyn knows uh, Ronnie Walker, who founded Alliance of Hope. Alliance of Hope is an amazing resource. They have an online forum that's moderated by therapists 24/7. So if you're up at like 2 in the morning, Marilyn, sometimes you are up at 2 in the morning and you can't sleep, you can go to the Alliance of Hope forum and actually get on
Post something. Yeah.
and post things and get support. It's all about survivors. That's what Alliance of Hope is all about. So we're at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to wrap it up. But
No
if
more questions? We didn't
I
miss.
don't, I don't, I don't have anybody that's posted any questions, but you can email. You're going to get, after the webinar, you'll get a little thank you for coming. If you think of something after the fact, there'll be a link to the email in there. You guys can post a question.
Post a question, we'll answer it.
Yeah, we'll answer. Oh yeah, absolutely, we'll answer it. So Marilyn, did you have any final thoughts before I read leave everybody with a thought for the day?
No, you go ahead and read. I've monopolized this
Well,
completely.
it's
It's
all
all
about
right.
you tonight. It's all about you.
Okay.
Okay, so the people that came on earlier, I had shared with you, I was going to read something for us to end this evening's session, and it's the book that it's out of. I hope you can see it. It's called Healing the Hurt Spirit, and the author is Catherine Greenleaf. I love this book because every day there's a little something, a couple of paragraphs of something, and I just love reading it. So today I'm going to read a paragraph, and it's called Life After Suicide. Yes, our lives have been altered by suicide. Some of us choose to sell our homes and move to other cities or states to start over again. Some of us quit our jobs and start new careers or go back to school. We leave religious affiliations or join new ones. And some of us continue on in the same locale and in the same occupations, yet feeling very different on the inside. There is no right or wrong decision about what to do with our lives after suicide. Over time, if we're patient with ourselves, we rediscover who we are and what we need to feel whole again. We begin to grow and change, and we begin to listen to our hearts. We're focusing our energy on who we are and what we want. Today, my heart will always lead me to where I need to go next. So with that, thank you so much for coming and being here. And let us know, do our survey and let us know how we did.
Okay. Thank you so much
Yes.
for the opportunity.
Thank you everyone for being here. Take care and have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.